All financial support for this podcast comes from my patrons on patreon.com. If you'd like to join in with the patrons, please check out patreon.com/DarwinGross. That's DarwinGrosse. Now enjoy the podcast. Okay, today I get an opportunity to meet someone new. This is again one of the interviews that's being sort of curated by Seth Cluett. He introduced me to this woman. I did a little research on the work and was really blown away. So I'm very excited to speak with her. Her name is Angelica Negrón, and she is a New York-based artist that has done some phenomenal work. One of the things I'll do is I'll make sure that in the podcast notes that I provide some links to some of the performance video, as well as a little documentary that she shared with me. It's really interesting work, and I'm really excited to be able to learn more about it. So with no more ordeal, let's talk to Angelica. Hey, how's it going?
Hi, I'm doing great. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. And I really appreciate you taking the time to have this discussion with me. Unfortunately, this morning you ran into a little issue with your dog. So I'm glad that got settled down and we can have a nice chat.
Yes, Mitty is all good now.
I love the fact that you have a dog named Mitty. That makes me so very happy, I will tell you.
He's definitely a Mitty.
So to get started, why don't I have you describe your work a little bit?
So I'm really interested in combining electronics with acoustic instruments, and my approach to electronic music comes mostly from my interest in found sounds and collecting sounds around me and manipulating them. So even though I'm processing them electronically, I would say 99% of the source always comes from an acoustic sound, and I love playing with this idea of accessibility and finding ways that electronic music and contemporary music can be inviting and accessible to diverse audiences that are not limited to academia or concert halls.
Right. And I think what's interesting is in looking at your stuff and having seen some of this in action, when you talk about accessible, you're not necessarily just talking about making it so that people can attach themselves to the instruments, but you're actually, one of your concerns is sort of like the expense that it takes to get involved in these things, and you're interested in finding a way to use more, maybe like more organic sources or more low priced or accessible from an economic standpoint, right?
Yeah, definitely. I'm really interested in demystifying this whole notion of electronic music as something really, really complicated and expensive that is only for a few people that can afford it. And same with music, actually. Both electronic music and classical music have a historic baggage that has a lot to do with privilege too. So I'm really interested in finding ways to invite people in and think and invite them to think about the world around them as a possibility for anything that can make sound, and also inviting them to make sounds without even thinking about all the historical baggage that comes with the word composer.
Right.
Yeah, because that was something that I grew up playing violin, and it was something that for me was a really alienating thing to the word composer itself because of my experience. But yeah, I'm just really drawn to trying to find ways to invite people in and to also let them kind of find a way to listen to their surroundings in a different way and be more curious.
Right. Absolutely. Now, one of the things that I found very interesting of the things that you shared for me and I did some research on, there was a little kind of mini documentary that was done by Brick TV that kind of did two things. First of all, it showed, I think, what a lot of people would find, to be a curiosity, which is you going out and getting vegetables and using sensors to attach to them and using those as triggers for kind of a computer thing. But it also showed you going through, I don't know, I guess it was like a shelf or a cupboard of little things that you've collected over time. And I saw that starting. I was like, oh, great, a neat little collection of fun toys. And then you actually started playing them, and I was like, oh my God, I never really thought of all the different ways that even a simple, like the guts of a music box or the chimes from inside of a grandfather clock, how many different ways you can make sound or you can interact with that in a way that's clearly musical.
Yeah, I mean, and that's something that I've been collecting toys and exploring different sounds of instruments and objects around me for a long time, but it never ceases to surprise me the many possibilities of each object, no matter how small it is. And it actually all started with a music box that I had as a child that has kind of a dark history to it. When I was a child, I was 3, and one of my aunts sadly passed away with 5 of my cousins in a car accident.
Oh my.
And I remember when this, I was 3, so this was a long time ago. But my most vivid memory was my grandmother handing out the toys of the kids that had of my cousins that had just passed away to the other cousins, because they were a big family. And I remember getting a Care Bears plush toy and this strawberry shortcake music box that is still with me to this day. And so this music box was a kind of a very special object in my life.
Mm-hmm.
And I always remember that I not only loved the first thing you hear when you hear a music box, the kind of nostalgic, beautiful bell-like sound, but I also love that the sound that it made when I was cranking it, and that it sounded a little off, and there was something also. This has to do with the memory of the object for me. It also has some kind of not only nostalgic child connotations, but also a kind of darkness to it that for me has been always really appealing. And that kind of started my obsession with collecting music boxes and toy instruments.
Right. Well, and it's interesting you bring that up, because a lot of times it's those kind of dark and personal stories that end up making like really deep connections for us as artists with things. And even though we may not, tell that tale to everybody that shows up at a concert, hopefully those depths of feelings actually come out in the work that we do, right?
Definitely. Yeah, definitely.
Now another thing that you shared that is sort of like the flip side of this really kind of personal and kind of performative thing is some of the stuff you share that is like the compositional work and its performance. So you shared a really neat kind of percussion-based performance called Gone, which was immaculately filmed and performed and recorded. That was really great, but also kind of a preview of something they'll call the Course of the Forest. Has that Course of the Forest, has that been performed? No?
Yes, it was premiered in November, the first week of November.
Okay.
We had 4 performances of it over a weekend at the New York Botanical Garden. It was a commission from them, and it was a site-specific piece for the Thane family forest.
Ah, okay.
Yeah.
I always love site-specific work because, first of all, it by definition is kind of time limited. But secondly, it more than almost any other kind of performative act, it's sort of like you have to be there or you're never going to experience it, right? I mean, even if you experience a recording of it, that's not the same as the experience of being there. Now, can you explain for listeners what the Course of the Forest was and how you were able to put this together?
Course of the Forest is a piece that I wrote last year as part of a residency I was doing at the New York Botanical Garden. The New York Botanical Garden is a gorgeous and huge botanical garden here in the Bronx. And it is one of my favorite places in New York to visit. And they've had for the past few years artists in residence, mostly in the visual arts side. But this is the first time that they had a composer in residence. And when they approached me about this, they immediately said, "We want you to write something for our forest and using voices." So the idea of it being site specific and using chorus was something that came from them. That was our kind of departure point, and it was a true luxury to be able to be in residence there, because I was able to go as often as I wanted. They gave me tours with horticulturists and a lot of resources from their education department. And what struck me about the forest, besides its massive size, were all the little pockets that I found within it and how the soundscape shifted depending on where I was. And I knew I wanted to do something that highlighted those sounds. So I decided to put, I think we ended up having about 18 speakers throughout the forest. And it was with recorded sounds from some from the actual forest itself, some from other forests around the world. I was very lucky to be put in touch with this author David Haskell, who has a gorgeous book called The Songs of Trees.
Mm-hmm.
And he also does a lot of recordings with technology that I can't even begin to explain or even understand, but it's recordings from actually inside the trees themselves.
Oh, wow.
And I had this library from Haskell that was just kind of a dream to work with. And so I combined some of my own library of sounds with those sounds, and we had those in speakers throughout the forest. And then we had around 100 voices spread out in the forest. And I also collaborated with an instrument builder that I've been working with for a long time, actually, Nick Yeoman. He's a Brooklyn-based instrument maker, and he designed a lot of the instruments that I used for the piece that you were mentioning before that I wrote for So Percussion Gone.
Right.
So Nick designed also some instruments for the chorus of the forest, that using reclaimed wood as well, and then it was all about kind of this idea of bringing the forest to life and providing an experience for the listener that was immersive, but that also kind of heightened their awareness of the sounds around them, so that when they left, quote unquote, the piece, they would still feel like it was still going on, and they would listen
Right.
to the sounds around them in a different
new way.
way.
Right.
Yeah. So it was kind of an interesting challenge to create something that was modular, because some people started at a different spot in the forest than others. So the piece had to be built in a way in which maybe the beginning was the end for someone. So it had to work in a modular way. And also an interesting challenge for me to activate such a massive space in a way that people felt like they were immersed in an experience, but also felt that they were experiencing different sides of the forest and different narratives that all connected, but to keep them engaged for an experience of an hour.
So for this, when you said, I don't remember the exact number you said, but it sounded like you said like 100 voices. I mean, are 100. You talking about people singing in the forest?
Yes, so 100 people singing in the forest, and
that must have been amazing.
Yeah, it was something pretty special, and we're hoping to do it again this year. And we worked with 4 different choral ensembles, from professional ensembles to some community ensembles, like the Celia Cruz High School choir. They're a fantastic group of high school students that are excellent singers. And we had, I organized it in 4 different choral modules, I call them. And each one was between 10 and 20 singers, except for one, which was the kind of the hub of the piece, which was over a bridge that overlooks the Bronx River, in which the river is actually another instrument itself.
Yeah.
And in over the bridge we had 60 singers.
Oh my goodness. And then these instruments that you had built, what kind of instruments were they? Were they like stringed instruments, bowed instruments, wind instruments, or percussive? What kind of instruments did you have built?
So these were percussive
Oh,
instruments. We
okay.
ended up calling them arborealis, and they were made out of wood, and then they had wood blocks and also bells and chimes attached to them. And Nick created a mechanism so that I could program what I wanted them to play and they would play themselves. So it's essentially a mechanical percussion
Got
instrument,
it. Okay.
with different bell tones and also wood block sounds. That my idea was for it to kind of combine with, like, just kind of feel like some of them might be coming from the forest themselves, some simulating woodpeckers and kind of short
Sure.
percussive sounds.
This sounds fascinating. I want to learn more, but before we go there, I would like to know a little bit about your background, because one of the things I would say, just from first of all, from looking at some of the material that you've done and just from talking to you, it's really clear that you don't feel constrained by the world around you at all. In terms of being a composer, you have a very wide open and embracing perspective on what it means to be a composer, what your instruments can be, and how you present them. And I'm curious how you get to be that composer. And so I'm wondering, what is your background? What was your early musical influences? What were the things that then drew you into being the composer and the artist that you are today?
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned that, because I feel like it wasn't always that way, and it took me a long time to get to this place of feeling completely, or at least a lot more free than I was before. But I started playing I started playing piano when I was about 7 years old. And I was born and raised in Puerto Rico, in Carolina, which is infamous or famous, depending on how you look at it, for being the birthplace of reggaeton. And I I grew up playing piano and I wanted to play cello. They told me my hands were too small, so they gave me a violin. So I became a violinist. And I played in orchestra, so always loved music, but was kind of like in the back of the second violins, just more interested really about what was going on with the cellos and violas and the brass section and the percussion than playing my scales in the violin. But I had no idea that composers were alive, and that was even a possibility, because I never played anything by someone
By someone who
living.
is alive, right? Absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, if we were lucky, we got to play Debussy maybe. So when I started my undergraduate, I knew that I loved music. I still didn't see myself as a concert violinist, but what I did was I really loved film as well. So I did two undergraduate degrees at the same time. I was studying film in the University of Puerto Rico, and I was continuing my violin studies in the conservatory, because I that didn't feel completely right for me being a violinist, but I didn't know there was another option, and I knew I loved music, so I just continued studying violin. And because I was in the university studying film, I started being in touch with a few friends, new friends that were part of the underground DIY scene in San Juan, and started playing in bands. And so I was playing keyboards and exploring a little bit of electronics, and kind of keeping two separate lives, and one in the
Hmm.
conservatory playing an orchestra, and the other one as a film student. That really most of my friends were in the university, and I was playing shows with them or going to shows. and
Right.
and I remember I had this band, and we were tasked with this really fun challenge of creating the music for a live film score of a silent German film called The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. the early 20th century German
Right.
expressionist film. And so I wrote the music for that. And because my band happened to be a string quintet with a singer and that also did some live electronics, then I ended up writing everything on a score. And I remember the viola player from that band. He was not really a great viola player, but he was a composer, and he was like, I know you really don't like studying violin. Why don't you study composition? And I was like, is that a thing that people do? And he said, yes, there are three of us in the department, three guys, come be the fourth, and be the first woman too. And so I that was my third year in violin studies, and I switched to composition using as my portfolio that music that I had written for my band for the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari's live scoring thing.
Right, right.
And yeah, and I kind of everything just started to make sense. A little bit before that, I was taking harp lessons, cello lessons, and I really, when I was I loved the harp, and I still love the harp with all my heart. But I was spending more time in the soundboard of the harp, recording with a tape recorder, and
Right.
just and I remember I was playing a little bit with this software called Fruity Loops.
Yes.
It's super popular in Puerto Rico for making reggaeton, actually. And I discovered that I really didn't like the sounds that it came with, but I discovered that you could load your own samples. So I was recording things on a tape recorder and then loading those sounds into Fruity Loops and then creating kind of ambient music with that. And so it was a time of a lot of exploration and being really playful and free, because I just didn't know that was a craft that could be studied. It was just coming from a very genuine place. What's interesting is that once I started studying it, as great as it was to find something finally that made sense for me, it was also within the constraints of academia. So I felt like I had to write it in a certain way. And so I feel like I started losing a little bit of that playfulness and that exploration side of me, because I was more worried about what the score looked like or what could be interesting to talk about in a composition seminar. But that's been something that over the past, I would say, 13 years since I moved to New York, it's been a lot of undoing of that and trying to reconnect with that initial impulse to explore sound and to make music.
Sure. So what brought you to New York then?
I moved to New York to pursue a master's at NYU.
Oh, okay.
And then decided to continue a doctorate that is still ongoing, if that is if that is still a thing. It is. I feel like I'll be a forever ABD student.
Right.
But
Yeah.
once I write that dissertation, I will be finished. But yeah, it's on hiatus at the moment, just because I had to decide between writing music or words, and
Sure.
it's always going to be music for me.
Right.
One day I'll come back to it. And I decided to stay here. It just felt like a really perfect place for a composer to be. And I'm also really involved in education, and there's really beautiful work being done here with young composers, and that's something that really feeds my art as well, and that is important to me to maintain. So it feels like a good place to be in, though I dream of returning to Puerto Rico and starting something there with young composers as well.
So what exactly is like the challenge of working with young composers? I mean, quite frankly, I remember when I was like 35 before I could even look in a mirror and say, I'm a composer, right? So to me, like a kid that's able to stand up and say, I'm a composer, I'm a young composer, I mean, that has got to be an incredible barrier to leap already. What are some of the challenges, or what are some of the opportunities that you find in working with composers that happen to be young?
Yeah, well, it's interesting that you say that, because I think that a lot of my passion for teaching young composers is precisely that. It is trying to kind of dismantle this idea of the notion of what a composer is, and empowering them to realize that if they're organizing sounds, in a way that they are excited about, then they're composers. So I work a lot with actually very young kids that in a program by Near Philharmonic called Very Young Composers. So they start around 8, and I this is something that I feel really strongly about, because I always remember how when I was a young girl, I never got to play with sound. I got to play with colors and visual art materials and paintings and clay and textures. But in music, there was always a right or wrong way. It was all about technique and playing your scales in the violin, and learning the repertoire. So there was never that playful side in school for me of exploring sounds themselves. And I honestly think that even if I didn't want to become a composer later, that would have made me a better violinist and better musician and better human, to be honest, too. Because there's a lot of transferable life skills that you acquire when you're dealing with so much ambiguity and exploring the unknown and collaborating with other people. So I really love working, especially with really young kids, because it just reminds me that everything is a possibility, and that we get to do something that's pretty cool, which is play around with sounds. And sometimes, especially with commissions and deadlines, sometimes that's at least for me, easy to forget, and to reconnect to that playful side of it, and to be excited again by the sound of a bow in a cymbal, and see their face when they hear that for the first time. It's really, really exciting. And in terms of challenges, I would say that notation is a huge one for sure. And I work with students for enough years to see them transition from me helping them scribe their ideas, and then being completely liberated by not having to worry about notation, because I'm taking care of that. It's all their ideas, but I'm scribing them. But I see them transition to when we want them to be more independent, how with notation their creativity tends to suffer, because it's a really hard thing to do. And I think a lot of composers still, at late stages of their career, they still struggle with this, translating something that's inside your head to a paper,
Right.
to communicate to someone else. So imagine if you have just started studying music and don't have those rhythmic or pitch skills to translate that. It's really hard. So that's one of the main challenges that I encounter. I try to, as a mentor, guide them in a way that to give them as many tools as I can to document their ideas, so that they're not limited by traditional notation, and that they have ownership of the work they're creating.
That's really interesting. I was curious to know how extensively you got into notation, or how much you allowed them to get drawn into it, or whatever, because it does seem like with if you're coming at this from the approach of like, let's experiment with sound, if you're requiring specific kinds of notation, it could really quickly become, sort of like the introspection it takes to well document your work can sometimes be something that makes it really frazzling to be free in terms of an interpretation, right?
Yeah, because it requires a lot of advanced skills and technique. Yeah, so it's definitely a challenge and a balancing thing in every class. I feel fortunate that I'm in the program that I work for. It's mostly with students that are. It really is all about the children's ideas. So we try our best not to compromise their ideas, and if as long as the ideas are coming from the child, it doesn't matter if they're not able to notate them. We
Right.
can help them with that, as long as they're making the choices about orchestration, they're making the choices about pitches, rhythms. If they can tap it, sing it, then it's going on the page.
Uh-huh.
So it's this idea of giving them a sense of empowerment, but also a sense of ownership of their ideas. And then also it's part of the challenge as they grow in the program to also find ways to give them the tools so they can, I don't want to say notate, but document their ideas and communicate that to musicians too. And maybe that for a student that could be on a staff paper. For another one, maybe it's a graphic notation. Maybe for another one, it's an audio voice memo that her mom sends me at 1 a.m. and so it looks looks different ways, but it's important for them to feel like they're all valid forms, because we're really not trying to, some of them might be composers, but it's rare. It's mostly just given them a chance to experience composing the same way that we experience visual arts as when we're young, and as something that can make you as an artist and as a human more well-rounded.
Sure. Now you talk about in your background, you talk about kind of like having all of these different these kind of different directions kind of come crashing together in terms of making you who you are. I love this idea of sort of like being a conservatory violinist while at the same time sort of like back channeling your way into film school and being in bands and stuff. To me, that seems like a really rich combination, but also one where each one of those camps would probably look funny at the other work that you're doing, right?
Yep. Yeah, that was a big struggle, I would say, in my life. And my friends that played with me, like my conservatory friends that played with me in orchestra, had no idea that I had a band, or some of them that I was studying film. I kept those things very separate and struggled a lot, because in my brain they all made sense together and they all fed of each other, but fed from each other. But I never got especially when I was living in Puerto Rico, I never felt comfortable exploring, let's say, something more pop like I would do in my band in a string quartet that I was writing, because it sounds a little bit funny for me to say that now, with what I've been doing for the past 12 years, which is precisely that, and embracing all sides of me as one. But at the moment, I felt like I had to be very academic, very cerebral, and be a good student. It's a weird thing when you're studying your craft, because you want to be a good student. You want to be you want to follow what your mentors are telling you, sure. and that might not always be what feels right for you or the right path for you. And so it took me a while to kind of figure out that I could just really write the music that I wanted to listen to. Really, it's as simple as that. It sounds kind of obvious for a composer, but
well, no, I mean it's a thing. When I've talked to other composers, there seems to be that kind of conflict, either a conflict between, like you said, the difference between being a performer and a composer, or especially people who find that their composition work ends up being very different from their performance work. There's a real difficult kind of like gluing together of their soul that has to happen in order to make that happen. Did you feel like you ever kind of were able to combine that while you were in Puerto Rico, or did that really come together for you once you moved to New York?
I would say when I moved to New York, actually. In Puerto Rico, first I thinking about it now, I'm like, how did I do that to be young? But I was super busy because I was doing full-time in two different universities, like a university and conservatory. So I was full-time student in both places doing two different majors. So I also kept myself really busy playing in bands. And I was very good actually about kind of putting things in different boxes and having separate lives. And that was because I just didn't feel like it was okay for me to share my band music in my composition class or with my mentors or my peers. But also I was also a young composer in the sense that I had just found out when I was like 19, 20 that composing was a possibility. So I would say that really kind of clicked when I moved here right after I finished my master's. And while I was doing my master's, New Amsterdam Records was starting, and so there was a lot of visibility and representation of composers that were also in bands, and that was something actually that was celebrated.
Okay.
And so that was something that impacted me. And I was like, actually, that's what I've been doing for and trying to suppress for a long time. You mean it's cool now? Great. So I remember that being something that was validating. But still, I was studying a master's, and I was, complete culture change too, of moving from a tiny island to New York. I remember as soon as I finished my master's, I was commissioned to write this piece for a trio, Janus Trio. They're a Debussy trio. And I remember starting this piece that ended up being called Drawings for Miyoko. I started it like 3 or 4 times, and I just didn't like what I was writing. And it was the first piece that I was writing for myself, not for, I did not have to show it to any composition teachers or anything. I was writing it for myself, but the added pressure was that it was a commission that they were going to record in an album.
Got it.
And I remember starting it many times, and then there was a moment that I was so desperate, and I was like, it's due tomorrow. What can I do? This is clearly not working out. And I said, what happens if I, instead of opening finale or playing at the piano with my empty staff pages, what if I open Fruity Loops and load some samples and start playing around? And I composed that piece in one day. And it was a big revealing moment of like, I just thought of it as if I was writing my ambient music or the music for my band Balloon. I was just like, let me just not care about how this score is going to look. Let me just write something that I like, because these are all instruments that I really love and I'm really excited about it. Then there's clearly a disconnect. Why can't I write something for them if I'm excited about it? It's not that I don't have ideas. It was something else that was kind of that felt very constraining. And as soon as I did that, it was just incredibly liberating, and they recorded it. So I was also lucky to get a good recording of it and production with it as well, which felt right for that piece. So that gave me a lot of confidence of like, maybe this is actually something that there's something here. This sounds like everything is starting to make more sense, like embracing all the different components of my identity, as a Puerto Rican living in New York, as a violinist that plays in electronic pop bands and that loves ambient music. All those things don't have to be separate.
And even as somebody who has fun playing Fruity Loops, I mean, that all this stuff pulled together. It's
right. Even the tools. That's interesting, because it's sometimes that was a big constraint too. It was like I had to make music in this certain ways that composers make music.
Yeah.
So it started really with that piece and with Fruity Loops, and it was a big moment for me. And I think it was like when I found out about composing, I never looked back after that. It was the same when I started to be true to who I am as a composer, that it just doesn't make any sense for me to go back and write things that I'm not excited about.
Right. Well, that's a real powerful story, though, because in fact, there is this sense that as we get more serious about our output, we're supposed to get more serious about our tools. We're supposed to get more serious about what our website looks like. We're supposed to get more serious about the equipment that we purchase. All of this stuff ends up getting wrapped up into some sort of like cultural milieu that doesn't really have anything to do with making a composition, and instead has something to do with looking like a capital C composer, right?
Right. Yeah, definitely. And I think that's why I also continue teaching, as challenging as it's been over the past few years, to maintain that, because it's a lot of work. I still like to, even if I'm just teaching one class, I still like to maintain that, because it reminds me precisely of that, of just letting go and embracing the most genuine things, and all the things that make up who I am, all the the quirky things, all the dark things, all of it
Hmm.
could be really powerful if you're honest to yourself and combine it and put in your work.
Sure. So now, when you sit down to have fun in composing, what does that look like? I mean, by some accounts, looking at that Brick TV documentary, maybe it means going out and getting the right cauliflower. But I, I
Certainly,
assume.
yes.
I mean, do you still use Fruity Loops, or have you found something else that's more fun for you, or do you just not
I
care?
Well, I use Ableton Live, and I've been using it for the past, I would say, 10 years.
Okay.
So I moved away from Fruity Loops, and mostly because I was doing some film composing, and I heard that you could load video on Ableton, so I started using Ableton for that, and then that's actually my main composing tool. Is even if I'm writing a piece for orchestra, I'm always on Ableton,
Okay.
back and forth between Ableton and Finale, which is the notation software I use.
Mm-hmm.
But I love, especially when I'm starting any project, starting with collecting sounds and creating a sound library for that specific project, and going outside in my kitchen. I always find more and more things, and even the same walk maybe with a different mallet or with different thing to hit it sounds completely different. So I'm always trying to find new ways of of recording objects that are familiar to me and finding new objects as well. And I also, if I'm working with different technology and like Nick's instruments, for example, I love setting them up and playing around with them. Nick builds this really cool instruments called surface poppers that it has a little solenoid that goes up and down, and you can program rhythms MIDI through it. Actually, that's the same technology that we use for Chorus of the Forest instruments.
Okay.
And with those surface poppers, anything that you put on top of that, it hits it in the rhythms that you program through MIDI. And I can play with different surfaces. I can play with putting marbles inside the different objects and moving the object a little bit, playing with the dynamic and the attack, and all of those things create variations in sound. So I really like this exploratory, playful beginning to a project in which I'm just kind of starting from scratch and playing around with the technology, with the tools, with the objects, with the sounds, and seeing how can they morph and give identity to the new piece.
Right. Well, and the other thing I love is, again, you're not like bound to the normal way that things are supposed to sound or be played. I mean, again, in that film, the way that you would manipulate the chimes, or the way you'd manipulate a music box voice, you clearly don't mind manipulating things manually in order to get the sound you want. I wonder, how is it that gets translated to performance? Because one of the things is, you've been commissioned by a lot of different people to do work for them. How do you take something that might be really an idiosyncratic way that you touch or bang on or rub or scrape an item? How do you transmit that to somebody who is going to perform this?
It's a great question. I feel like a lot of my work has to do with answering that question. And so that's another part of the exploration, is also kind of the question of how to translate the performance of electronic music live. And a lot of these sounds sometimes are performed live, and there's a percussionist that is doing those specific actions live in a performance, as I would when I'm playing in my studio. But a lot of the times they're recorded, and maybe there's a plant leaf or a cauliflower or a turnip that I touch that then triggers the sound of the little noise from my music box. So So I'm really interested in finding kind of like different layers and different ways of I don't want to say confuse the ear, but first make the performance of electronic music more visible and visceral, the same way that when you see a string quartet, you see and you feel in your gut that's bow on the string. I'm always kind of searching for this this same feeling in electronic music and the performance of it. And for me, live processing was never enough for that. I wanted to see the action behind the sound, which is why I love working with Nick's instruments. They're really kind of rudimentary mechanical percussion in which everything is very visible, and you can things can go wrong, objects can fall. I want electronic music to feel alive. So it's different for every piece. Sometimes it's in pre-recorded electronics. Sometimes it's in electronics that are played live by either a sampling pad or a veggie synth. I wrote a piece for the New York Phil Biennial for a chamber ensemble with musicians from the Phil a few years ago, and I had the percussionist play a synth that was made up of fruits, and that's a kind of different instrument to learn how to play, and it also
Sure.
could, like, the apple could fall, and those and you have to touch it in a certain way, and it's so I'm always looking for ways of making it more playful, more alive, more inviting for the audience, because I at the end of the concerts a lot of people um, come to check out the instrument just because they're curious, and they might be interested in. I've had people that then have emailed me afterwards, or colleagues that have emailed me later, like pictures of their kids, like, oh, I got this makey kit for my kid, and because they saw you play with your plants or your vegetables, and that's really what I'm after, is this idea that a lot of the times when I went to performances of electronic music, it felt a little bit, I felt a distance, and I want to create the opposite experience, that it feels like you're drawn to the sounds, maybe because of the visual, but then you're so immersed that then you're in it for the sounds themselves. So finding creative ways to approach that and to invite people in, it's a lot of what I think every piece that I write searches for.
Sure. Well, unfortunately, Angelica, we are out of time. I can't believe it. I have literally a whole page of questions more that I would wish to ask. But before we let you go, what do you have cooking right now? What's some of the new work that you're working on that people might be able to see or hear soon?
So I just got commissioned by the LA Phil to write a new piece for the orchestra that's going to be premiered in November. So I'm incredibly thrilled about that and terrified, as with all exciting projects. So I'm writing a piece for the LA Phil that's going to be performed alongside the symphonic dances from West Side Story, which is a piece that, as a Puerto Rican, I have many feelings about. Good,
Right.
bad, and complicated.
Sure.
So I'm sure the piece that I'll be writing for them will reflect some of that. And I'm also I just finished working on the music for a documentary about life in Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria, and I'm really excited about that work. And that's going to be premiered at Tribeca Film Festival here in New York in April. And yeah, a lot of other orchestral commissions, one for the Dallas Symphony and the National Symphony, and so for orchestra and organ, and some chamber ensemble works too, and choral works. I'm doing a residency with the San Francisco Girls Chorus. They're an incredible group of young girl singers, and working with Brooklyn Youth Chorus too, just trying to keep busy and survive and enjoy the ride.
Well, that sounds like a heck of a attempt at survival. It sounds amazing. Congratulations on all these opportunities.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, well, with that, I'm going to let you have the rest of your day. Thank you so much again for making the time to have this discussion.
My pleasure.
All right.
Thank you.
Goodbye. Well, many thanks to Angelica for having that great chat with us. Very inspiring. Really makes me think about remembering to keep the joy in the work that we do. I want to thank all of you for continuing to listen. I want to thank those who are supporting me through patreon.com for your continued support. Each week I get a few new subscribers, which really does help out a lot. I do appreciate that. And if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, drop me a line, ddg@cycling74.com, ddg@20objects.com, or darwin.gross@gmail.com. They'll all get to me. With that, I want to thank you for your time, and we will catch you next time around. Bye.